Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Aaron Stauffer, and I want to welcome you to a Religions for Peace USA webinar, which is co-hosted by the Religion Communicators Council. This webinar will feature Jim Winkler, who's the General Secretary of the National Council of Churches, and Cherilyn Crowe, the Director of Communications from the Baptist Joint Committee for Religious Liberty. Cherilyn also functions as the DC convener of the DC chapter for the Religion Communicators Council. We're thankful for the work that the RCC has done in promoting and setting up this webinar, and I look forward to the wonderful conversation that we'll cover today. The substance and content of the conversation will really address the horizons of interfaith peacemaking and the way in which we communicate this sort of work. So we will address the issues of what this work involves and how we communicate it to those we're working with. Jim will speak to more of the efforts that the NCC is addressing in interfaith peacemaking, and Cherilyn will talk to the ways that the Baptist Joint Committee for Religious Liberty fights for religious liberty for all and sort of organizes and how it goes about its work with partners in many different religious traditions and their own organization. So without any further ado, I really just want to turn it over to Jim and have us begin our conversation.
Thank you, Aaron. I really am honored to have the chance to be on this webinar with you and with Cherilyn and to say a little bit about what we're trying to do here at the National Council of Churches. Of course, as you know, I'm still new here. I'm just entering my 7th month, I believe, 6 months as General Secretary, and it's really very exciting. There is never a dull day, and I am grateful that God has given me this opportunity to be in this role. Prior to working here at the National Council of Churches, I worked in this same building, the United Methodist building, with the United Methodist Board of Church and Society, and I really felt that prepared me in so many ways for this role. When I began with the United Methodist Church all those years ago, I reflected on my upbringing, and I thought that I'd really sort of been raised in a, shall we say, a Methodist cocoon. I was a son of a United Methodist pastor, and so a preacher's family's life revolves around the local church. But then, as I reflected further, I realized, no, my dad was pastor in a very ecumenical area in northern Illinois. My friends were Jews and Armenians and Catholics and Germans and Italians and Poles. It was a very, very mixed working class area. I went to school with African Americans and Latinos. After college, I worked with the Pacific Conference of Churches in Fiji, which was an ecumenical venture. So I had kind of fooled myself in a sense to believe that I had sort of been raised and lived my life in this single denominational cocoon. And then at the Board of Church and Society, everything that we did in terms of working for social justice concerns, whether it was on gun violence or peace or hunger or poverty or racism, everything had to be done in an ecumenical and interfaith manner if we were going to have any positive impact, especially on policymakers. In fact, of course, we found that if we went to meet with policymakers as a group of not just Christians, but also Muslims, Jews, Sikhs, Hindus, and so forth, we had more impact. We were more impressive, shall we say. So all of that past has been so incredibly valuable and preparatory for me as I come into the National Council of Churches. The NCC has worked, I believe, in an interfaith manner for quite some time. And this really, in a lot of ways, reflects not only the reality of our world, but the changing reality here in the United States, of course. You know, it used to be when I was a kid, we even said with a straight face, we distinguished between Christians and Catholics. I still am amazed looking back on that. And when we thought interfaith, we thought of Christians and Jews. And the growing Muslim population has dramatically changed that. And I've been privileged to work closely with the Islamic Society for North America as the years have gone on, in particular. But other Muslim organizations, of course, play an important role. And how exactly we go about that, I think, is often on a case-by-case basis. I'll give you an example. About 10 years ago, when I was with the United Methodist Church, the American Jewish Committee approached me and other denominational leaders and said, we want to talk about our differences on the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. We all agreed that we wanted to see a peaceful resolution to that long-standing conflict, but we had significant, to say the least, disagreements on how to accomplish that. So we had a long dialogue, and there were times where I was happy to be part of that dialogue and times where it drove me crazy. But I recognized the value of trying to work through our differences. We went to Israel and Palestine together. We had regular meetings where we would focus on a particular area, such as theology of the land or whatever. Now there's also a Muslim-Christian dialogue. However, in both instances, I'll tell you where we're at the moment, and that is the National Council of Churches went through significant restructure in the last few years. Basically came face to face with the declining membership of the 37 member communions within the NCC, with the fact that our budget was out of balance, and we simply didn't have the resources to deploy that we did in the past. We've come through this wrenching, difficult restructure, and so the Muslim-Christian dialogue will be getting back on track in the next few months, I pray and hope. The Jewish-Christian dialogue actually was suspended by our Jewish colleagues in October of 2012, when a group of Christian leaders sent a letter to Congress asking for an investigation of the possible misuse by Israel of American military aid in perpetuating human rights abuses, particularly, of course, against Palestinians. American Jewish groups were not happy with that letter, and therefore they suspended the dialogue. However, in March of this year, they invited us, the National Council of Churches and leaders of a number of key member denominations of the NCC, to sit down with them in New York City, and we agreed to get the dialogues back on track. So part of peacemaking, I have learned, of course, is literally engaging in dialogue, intentional, regular dialogue. Beyond that, then, we've got to find places where we can be in partnership together to make a difference. So if I'll use one example, and then maybe I'll just pause at that point. A couple of months ago, the Armenian Orthodox Church, a member communion of the NCC, contacted me to express concern about attacks that had taken place against the largely Armenian Christian village of Kasab in Syria, and asked us to speak out on behalf of Armenian Christians, and we did so, and they're deeply appreciative of that. Sometimes it's hard to know exactly what impact something like that has, but standing in solidarity with one another is an important part of what we do. I mentioned this to Jewish colleagues, who quickly said, "I wish that you had told us. We would have stood with you." It was a good reminder of that we have opportunities to work together that we sometimes pass up, not intentionally, but simply out of the press of business, the crush of events, and we don't actually magnify the impact that we could, because we're focused on getting a statement produced, of trying to check the facts, of just doing that daily work. And yet, if we had done it with Jews and Muslims, for example, we might have had a much more we might have brought much more attention to bear on the tragedy in Kasab than we did.
Well, thank you very much, Jim. Those stories are exactly what we're looking for, those moments in which we really bring to life these ideas and these values that we find ourselves committed to and engaged in. So I hope to talk with you more about that once after we hear from Cherilyn. But I do want to offer a turnover now to Cherilyn to hear more about the work that she engages in and the Baptist Joint Committee for Religious Liberty.
Thank you, Aaron, and thank you, Jim, so much. It's good to see you. Jim's a former speaker to our local D.C. chapter of the Religion Communicators Council. It's always good to have him here with us as well today. Let me talk a little bit about the Baptist Joint Committee. So we've been around since 1936, and really our focus is to defend the first freedom of the First Amendment. That means kind of striving to protect the free exercise of religion while also defending against its establishment by the government. As we do that in lots of different ways. And as a Baptist, we come at interfaith work and this sort of defense of religious freedom for all religions because of our history. Really, since colonial times, Baptists have worked in the light with other believers and non-believers alike. We find kind of common cause. And that's sort of our sort of common cause effect throughout this. I mean, in America, obviously, we have the First Amendment that protects us. And America's sort of experiment, if you will, in religious liberty has been so successful because it protects those sort of outsider or fringe groups, if you want to call it that. And they included Baptists in colonial times. I think also, about Catholics and Mormons in the 19th century and Jehovah's Witnesses and Christian Scientists in the 20th century. So Baptists kind of know these hard lessons of history. And we had Thomas Helwes in England, who was thrown in prison for daring to write that the king is a mortal man and not God, and therefore has no control over the immortal souls of his subjects. They're like, well, go to prison. So we see that. We have in colonial America, Baptists in Virginia had to get a license to preach the gospel. If they didn't get this license, they'd be whipped or put in prison as well. And so it was just sort of state control of religion and the sort of, religion for me but not for you that we learned as Baptists. This is not how it should be. And really worked with Sons of the Enlightenment as well to kind of push Madison towards that First Amendment that he created that kind of protects religious freedom for all people and prevents the government from establishing one religion over another. Because really, as we saw in colonial times, a threat to anybody's religious liberty is really a threat to everybody's religious liberty. So we want to kind of gird that and protect that for people. And Jim spoke well to the changing demographic. I mean, colonial times today is very different, but that principle, that kind of bedrock statement is still the same. And so the Baptist Joint Committee, one thing for communication purposes for us, you never want to pretend you are somebody you're not. I mean, we definitely declare we believe these rights are God-given, but our friends who are secular humanists may not see the rights coming from that same way, but we all agree that freedom of religion includes freedom from state-sponsored religion. That's what we kind of can combine together. So you never want to not be somebody you are and be that sort of, distinct voice, but together we can be so much more. I used to do local TV years ago. I had a show one time with the Interfaith panel, and someone on the panel discussed how, people try to merge religion together and make it be one big melting pot, but really more of a tossed salad, where each element is still easily visible and can be seen, but they add to each other without taking away their unique qualities. And that's really kind of a girding principle for us in interfaith work. We need to claim that Baptist heritage and our Christian background, our faith, but we can work with anybody who has a common goal, and I respect my friends' right to believe how they want to believe, and they respect mine to believe how I want to believe. And so the Baptist Joint Committee's work is really kind of in three main areas and how we protect that. Litigation, legislation, and education. So litigation is going to be work in the courts. We don't bring lawsuits to the Baptist Joint Committee, but we join in, usually in front of the court briefs called amicus briefs for any lawyers out there. And because we know that religious freedom is protected by laws, so as courts interpret those laws, we've got to make sure that that Baptist witness and that sort of American tradition of freedom for all is protected and sustained. Recently, a few weeks ago now, we signed on to a brief with our friends at the American Jewish Committee to defend a Muslim prisoner's right to have a beard in Arkansas. It's a case called Holt v. Hobbs. It's coming before the Supreme Court. I believe it's this fall. They've not set a date yet. But that's kind of an example of, as Baptist Christians and our Jewish friends, we came together to defend this guy's right to have a beard in prison. The prison will make an exception for somebody with a skin condition to have a beard, but not for somebody whose religious belief mandates he have a beard. And so we feel that's unfair because religion in America should get that benefit, should get that protection as well. No matter if it's my belief or his belief, that's the country we live in. For legislation work, as I said, laws protect religious freedom, and so laws are made through the legislation process. We kind of monitor legislation as it comes up in Congress, just across the street here, keeping an eye on things, making sure we know when to weigh in, when to join with other coalitions of groups that may have people from all sides of the aisle and all sides of the religious spectrum together, kind of have one unified voice to say, we don't agree on religious belief necessarily, but we agree that this is going to hurt all of us in some way. Probably the best example of that is going to be back in the early 90s. The Supreme Court had a decision in Employment Division v. Smith that kind of undercut religious freedom in some way. Basically, the decision said that if the government makes a law that conflicts with a religious belief, then too bad. I'm oversimplifying that. And so Baptist Joint Committee joined with a broad coalition of groups from, Mormons, Scientologists, Jewish, Sikh, everybody across the table to push this law called the Religious Freedom Restoration Act. And that was kind of to restore that compelling interest that religion should get a benefit. Religion is something that deserves to be heard and seen and have a place in the conversation, and that belief should be protected. And it kind of, I don't want to get too technical in the legal aspect of this, but basically it gives religion a benefit and gives it its opportunity to be heard in court. And then education work. We do education across the board, be it education for school groups that come in about what their rights are, if they're a church group or just a college group or anybody, kind of explaining these First Amendment principles to them and what their rights are, what their responsibilities are. And of course, we do things, I feel like anybody who follows this sort of work wants to know what's going on. So we have a website with resources, an updated blog, and of course, social media as well, because some things happen in real time. And so we're so lucky to live in a time where we can do things immediately and not wait for the morning paper. It's good and bad, I know, but you want to make sure that you're staying on top of things because the conversation can change quickly and what's happening can change so fast as well. Let's kind of just get a baseline view of kind of what we do and where we come at this sort of interfaith work.
Well, thank you very much, Cherilyn. That's hearing about the stories about the Religious Freedom Restoration Act and the possibility of some of our viewers gaining some of these resources is important. I want to ask if there are, from both of you in your work, if we can get sort of, let's just cover this right now, some of the tangible resources that we can provide for our viewers and where they can find them, either on your website, but then also if there are a couple that you would highlight, we can make those available directly below this webinar, viewing on the Religions for Peace USA website shortly after when we finish up here too as well. So I want to really just turn it right back to Cherilyn and hear about what are some of the resources that individuals can, one, learn about the history, about how to go about participating in the work that the Baptist Joint Committee goes about, and then I'll turn directly to Jim, and I've got another follow-up for Jim too as well. So that's sort of how I'm steering this.
That's great. So we do have a website. We recently relaunched our website actually a few weeks ago to kind of have those resources easier to find. Kind of our goal is to equip people. In Baptist life, Baptists are very congregational, so we're kind of bottom up and not top down. So you don't really speak for Baptists, but you speak to Baptists. So we exist to kind of serve Baptists and kind of help them know what's out there, know the rules. One great thing, I actually have a copy of it here, which you can download from our website, is, this is a few years old now, but it's called Religious Expression in American Public Life, a Joint Statement of Current Law. It kind of looks at sort of 35 question and answer issues that kind of help people say, oh, so can the government do this? Can I do this? If I work for a federal agency, do I have to not be religious? And what are my rules there? It's very helpful for anybody trying to navigate sort of how to be a good citizen, how to follow the law, but also knowing that, your expression is also protected as well in America. We also have a lot of questions come up in our world about religion in public schools. What are the rules there? What can and can't you do? What should and should you not do? So we've got that on our website as well. I can send you links, Aaron, to make them available. But our website is bjconline.org, B, Baptist Joint Committee, online.org. And you'll see at the top menu there's going to be a Learn section. You'll see categories of resources there. We have a lot of things to help you kind of navigate these sort of church-state issues that come around and trying to find it's tricky these days, and so we kind of exist to be a resource for anybody who's got questions or wants to know kind of how to navigate that. And you can also see if you have more questions about our work with other groups, our interfaith work, we've got a section called Religious Liberty for All, because I feel like people want to know, one of our goals is to kind of foster these discussions in the public square, talk about these, interfaith work, and make sure people know, being a good Christian neighbor is to know your friends and know your neighbors as well. And so we kind of discuss our work there and what that looks like and how that protects freedom for all people, and we stand up for others, and they stand up for us as well.
Hey, Aaron, this is Jim. In terms of resources, as the NCC is re-emerging from this transition, I think you're going to see more resources created and developed. But There's also a little bit of a different philosophy that I think the NCC has tried to embrace here as we've moved out of this, and that is there was a time when the National Council of Churches staff itself was a huge staff, a great deal of money that produced a lot of resources. As we move forward, the NCC is really going to take more of a convening role. One thing that I have found that the National Council of Churches possesses is a tremendous amount of credibility, and if I may say so, I think almost everyone wants our endorsement, our imprimatur, or our support on certain things. We also have, I think, the ability to convene people, coalitions, events. I have attempted to come forward into this role with a degree of humility, rather than I've arrived, now I can be the chair of whatever organization or committee I'm relating to. Let me give you an example. We're focusing a lot now on mass incarceration, which is a real scourge in our society, with millions of people in jail, most of them for nonviolent crimes related usually to drug possession. This has disproportionately affected people of color in our nation. The National Council of Churches was an early leader in support of Dr. King and the Civil Rights Movement, and I think really helped to galvanize white church to wake up and face the sin of racism that it, of course, perpetuated. The mass incarceration crisis has echoes and resonance with the support of the National Council of Churches for the civil rights struggle back in the 60s and 70s. So there already exists a tremendous coalition of denominational and faith-based groups working on criminal justice reform. So we have entered that with enthusiasm, with excitement, attempting to find our niche, which will probably be looking at pre-trial sentencing, which also resonates with the past emphasis of the National Council of Churches in working on bail bond issues. But we are doing this in consultation with and in cooperation with many of our own denominational member communions, and with other groups such as Prison Fellowship that are part of this criminal justice reform working group. So it's really, I think, been a positive, appropriate, fresh way to approach this. What I find, too, is that we are associated with a significant number of coalitions, and that we can be, in a lot of ways, a clearinghouse for folks who are looking for resources. I have people contact me all the time asking me how they can become more knowledgeable about or connected to this, that, or the other issues. So we find ourselves at a nexus point where we're able to actually refer people to a lot of coalitions or organizations. For example, the Baptist Joint Committee is an incredibly important part, I believe, of the life that relates to the National Council of Churches. A number of our member communions, such as the American Baptist Churches, are part of BJC. When we are asked to sign on to an amicus brief, we contact BJC and ask them for advice. So the days when we might have a fleet of lawyers at the NCC are not with us anymore, but we don't need that because we have great expertise with partners like BJC just down the street. Now there are some other, I'd call them real-life type resources that are developing with the NCC. For example, we just had last month our first ever Christian Unity Gathering. We had about 250 people here in Washington for that event. We had Marion Wright Edelman of Children's Defense Fund, Harold Dean Trulier of Heeding God's Call, of Healing Communities, Dr. Iva Carruthers of the Samuel DeWitt Proctor Institute, and Jim Wallace of Sojourners as key presenters at that event. And then there were more resource people as well. So it was, how can we make a real difference here on mass incarceration? Not, here we are as the staff of the National Council of Churches and we're going to do it for you, but rather this has got to be something that our entire community, when I'm talking about the National Council of Churches alone, we're talking about more than 100,000 local churches spread out across the church, tens of millions of Christians. When we can galvanize that group of people to move forward on a matter such as ending mass incarceration or working in an interreligious manner for peace, we have, I believe, the possibility of making real, immediate significant change in the life of this nation.
I think Jim, you've hit on a very important point for the work of Religions for Peace USA as well. I think when you learn very quickly that with the changing landscape of the United States, the changing religious landscape of the United States, you realize that this work has to take place in a space where values are deeply held and widely shared. This is a space where we have to understand that we, as Cherilyn was talking about, living in this country allows religion under the First Amendment, that realization that this is something that is unique to the United States, and something that we can really serve to galvanize and fight for. But it also places a challenge for organizations like Religions for Peace USA. And that challenge is namely is the question of how do we bring everyone who's impacted by these issues together to the table? What are the strategies and tactics, and what are the archetypes and the avenues that we use to really convene this table as you're talking about it? I mean, certainly the National Council of Churches has a historical weight that is very powerful. But the realization is that I think that as we continue to go forward as organizations working in the civic sector, as fighting for our constituents and our members, that we have to employ new tactics. And one of those ways, if I can just speak quickly, is that for Religions for Peace USA, one of our endeavors is that we're fighting in the fight against Islamophobia. We're using this tactic called collective impact. And what this essentially looks like is it's a strategy that brings together organizations around a shared agenda and a way in which we collectively measure and understand how we will reach success together. What this does is essentially, as opposed to organizations working in a silo way, we end up working together completely across the table in such a way that we really do magnify our impact around these social issues, which are at times really hard to grasp. I mean, how do you measure religious sentiment or religious prejudice in a sort of scientific data way, except for really building and forming relationships that are substantive and sustainable? Those are things that we see that are exactly that I think ring in harmony with what you're talking about bringing people together across across issues and across boundaries that heretofore divided us. And that is done when we realize that we share a common environment, we share common values, and we have our differences, which make us distinct, and they're important and they're valuable. But the way in which we work together to create a better community is something that's extremely important. But the challenge is always how do you address the changing landscape? How do you address the changing environment of the economic and sort of organizational environment for your own work? Religions for Peace USA sees the collective impact model as a response to this, as a way that can continue to galvanize all the engines together all at once, so we have the strongest sort of force for this. But that does sort of lead me to the question of what are the challenges, though, that you see? What produce people or prevent people, from coming to the table for your work, and how do you respond to that? That's something that one of our audience members asked in the sort of question of, as we see things, we know things are changing, but what are the unique challenges that really that we face in this sort of work? I'd like to pose that to both of you and to hear your responses. So Cherilyn, if you want to go first, or Jim, since I was building off of what you're talking about, please feel free.
Cherilyn, you want to say a word?
Yes, I'll just say a couple of quick notes about that. I know that for us, the Baptist Joint Committee, sometimes one barrier can be people not knowing what each other's about. We have a section on our website now, like I mentioned before, about our work with other religions, because some people who maybe have one type of experience with a Baptist church or something else may think, oh, well, they won't want to do anything for me because I'm not Christian, I'm not Baptist, and so we want to make sure people know that this is what we're about. This is our history that we still embrace to this day. And here's some examples. We still obviously we claim that Baptist heritage and our Christian belief, but just letting people know that there's a place for them at the table when we're there as well. And you know, really up in DC especially, just knowing your neighbors and knowing your friends of other groups. And you know, there's some groups we're going to work with on some things and not with on other things based on what the issue is, what the position is. But you know, not being afraid to be open when each new thing comes up. Say, okay, no matter what's passed, who is going to work with us on this? And not hold against somebody if they were not involved in one way or the other way, because we all have different priorities. We all have different things we're focused on. And so when we have this one narrow religious liberty focus, we find ourselves having partners from the left and the right on the same things, on different issues based on that, just not being afraid to mix things up. That would be kind of one thing, I think, just kind of educating people about what we're about and also having a good history we can build upon.
I'd say that some of the barriers that that face organizations like the National Council of Churches is one that may sound in a way, I don't know, ironic. Maybe even sounds like we're trying to hold back the river of time, but it's not that at all. So let me give you an example. The ecumenical movement that began about 100 years ago, in which, particularly at that time, young people in organizations like the YMCA and the YWCA and the World Student Christian Federation, they began pushing the churches and saying these denominational boundaries need to be re-examined, and frankly, they need to be dispensed with. But there was a lot of loyalty to these tribal relationships, Methodist, Baptist, Lutheran, Presbyterian, and so forth. Nevertheless, gradually, I think that in our seminaries, we began training our pastors with the idea that the most important thing was being a faithful follower of Christ rather than being a member of a particular denomination. And in turn, they began teaching this to church members. And so now we're at a place where people move much more freely across denominational boundaries than they ever did before. Thanks be to God. And of course, with this other change taking place in this nation, with more and more people of different faiths present, we have a fascinating thing taking place in that we have denominations that are declining, partly, ironically, as a result of their success in pushing for greater unity. Another reason for the decline, quite frankly, is we don't have as many kids as we used to. It typically is the case that when you become more affluent, you tend to have fewer children than you did. But the decline, the numerical decline, has had the effect of creating a crisis of identity for many of these churches, a feeling that perhaps they're obsolete. And in turn, they're saying we need to reaffirm our denominational identities when at the local church level and the local community level, people aren't interested in that anymore. I don't know how that will work out as time goes forward, but there's still a need in the Christian community to grapple with different understandings of ministry, of baptism, of scripture, of women in leadership, and so forth and so on. These are still important things that have to be talked about. But I'll give you an example. I spoke out in Shenandoah, Virginia, in Winchester, Virginia, recently to the Valley Interfaith Council. I think it's been around about 15 years. It's fantastic. They have all these different faiths working together through this Valley Interfaith Council. This is happening all over the country. So a lot of Christian ecumenical organizations are transforming themselves into interfaith organizations. I actually think that we need to have both and, that there still needs to be a forum in which the Christians are dealing with their differences, because those are not insignificant, but where we're also working in an interfaith manner. So I don't know if I'm articulating this very well, but I find that part of what we have is that one of the very barriers that we face is actually the success that we've achieved in terms of moving toward ecumenical cooperation and relationships. Another thing that is often misunderstood is that these denominations that I relate to through the National Council of Churches, while they have tremendous communications capacities and they have lots of local churches and so forth, they actually don't communicate very effectively even within their own denominations. Local churches communicate, generally speaking, effectively with their own members, but local church members aren't often connected very well to what's happening beyond the walls of their own local church. I wish, pray that I could find a way for the denominations to cooperate or to communicate more effectively within their own denominations, between denominations, and in a way that the National Council of Churches could communicate more effectively, because we really could achieve a lot in terms of bringing an end to poverty, violence, racism, hunger, and so forth in this nation if we could really be in touch with our own people. And then finally, I think an age-old issue within the Christian community, and perhaps also in some other of our faith community, is frankly a reluctance to deal with social issues. There's a strong feeling that remains in many of our congregations that the church should not be dealing with, as they say, politics. And that may be even as something as simple as hunger in the community, or problems in the local schools, or violence against people of other faith groups and so forth. I think our church leadership sees this as an imperative, but there's still a reluctance among many of our people to get involved beyond just Sunday worship and Sunday school and youth mission trips and a few other things. And so we still have ways to go to bring our own people along into understanding that God's plan, God's intention for us is something that we may not completely understand at this point. And I think, and I'll conclude here, the National Council of Churches, when it began speaking out on civil rights many years ago, and standing up against the Vietnam War many years ago, and in more recent years standing up against the war in Iraq, those were very powerful and important developments. But it was known at the time that it would still upset some people. But the leadership of these denominations said, this is where we have to be as followers of Christ. We have to be working with one another, with people of other faiths, for peace and for harmony and for justice. And I think that imperative continues to be a very, very powerful influence within the National Council. I think it's powerful in many of our local churches, but still there is a disconnect, and I don't want to deny that. And I wish and pray that we could mobilize more of our own people to act on the teachings of Christ.
Absolutely. Yeah, thank you so much for both of your responses to this. And there are a couple cogent points, that were made, both around how we, as sort of actors in the fight for religious liberty for all, and how that involves us bringing all sort of different voices of faith to the table regarding these issues. How do we communicate with each other about that? Because that's an extremely important point, because the way in which we talk about what we do impacts the actual work about our actual doings and beings. So those are some very important points. But Jim, your last point, I think, is a very key question. This question of civic participation, about what it means to actually participate in a democracy in a way that upholds this deep tradition founded that we see glimpse in bits and pieces of and in fact in all of the Constitution. Those are things that we have to we have a challenge of carrying forward, and that is something that I think religions have always played a very important point of caring for this world, and how we work to care for this world, and to care for each other. So all those things are just key little takeaways for me today, both from our conversation with Cherilyn and Jim. I want to thank you both for being here and opening up to give you a chance to say any last question, any last points, or give any questions to our audience. But we will provide some of the resources that Cherilyn and Jim mentioned earlier in our webinar, and be sure to provide those beneath this webinar on the Religions for Peace USA website. Cherilyn and Jim, do you guys have any last thoughts?
I will say one quick thing, just for any communicator out there. The new AP style book has got a whole religion chapter in it. And so one thing I talked about before is how maybe other religions don't know us, but you should really know what the media and what people as a whole know about your religion, what they don't know about your religion. So it's got a chapter by different faiths, know the holidays, know who you're working with and around. And it's just a helpful thing to make sure that you are representing yourself well and you know what people know about you, what they don't know about you. So those barriers are not going to be there when you're trying to work across religious lines.
I'll say just a couple of words too. In that you had asked me about obstacles, and so I spoke about those. But there's really also just tremendous assets that exist, and you know, just a few things that I've been working on in recent weeks. I'll give you some examples. I spent time in Kenya, in East Africa, a couple of weeks ago with General Secretaries of National Council of Churches from around the world. And among others, I had long conversations with the General Secretary of the Cuban Council of Churches. How can we work more effectively together to bring an end to the distance between Cuba and the United States? Our churches remain in contact with one another. In fact, I believe tomorrow, my own brother, who's a pastor in Illinois, is going to be taking a group from his local church to spend time in Cuba working with Cuban Christians. But we were talking about crafting a multi-faith and interfaith campaign to try to put maximum pressure on the United States government to remove Cuba from the list of terrorist nations and to begin to move toward normalization of relations. A couple of other examples. I helped to host, along with Church World Service a few months ago, Christian Muslim leaders from the Central African Republic, where terrible violence has broken out between Christians and Muslims. The head Muslim cleric in the Central African Republic's home was destroyed by Christian extremists, and now he lives in the residence of the Catholic Archbishop. I think it's a very powerful example, powerful story. And so there's been an exchange of Christian and Muslim leaders between the U.S. and between the Central African Republic. I spent time speaking with the General Secretary of the Sri Lankan Council of Churches, where there's still tremendous tension between Buddhists, Christians, and Muslims in the country of Sri Lanka. We discussed ways to work to bring that together. The chair of the National Council of Churches, Reverend Dr. Roy Medley, General Secretary of the American Baptist Churches, is just back from a multi-religious delegation that went to Iran, where there were discussions with Christian and Muslim leaders in Iran about how to ease the tensions between our countries and resume normalization of relations. I could go on and on and on, but what I'm getting at is there are very real, specific situations within the United States and between our nation and other nations where there has been war or hatred or tension for a long time, where we know that working in an interreligious manner, we can actually change history for the better. We've done it before, and we're going to do it again. And so I am grateful to have, as friends and partners, Baptist Joint Committee and Religions for Peace, and I look forward to us working and making it on earth as it is in heaven. Thank you.
Absolutely. Well, amen. And thank you both for being here. And I want to thank all of our viewers who were able to tune in and, again, be looking for the resources that will follow shortly after. And, again, just thank you, Cherilyn, and thank you, Jim, for your time today.
Thank you.
All right. And we'll see you all next month with another webinar for Religions for Peace USA. Thank you all.